On today's World Insight, crisis in Ukraine, with Russian peacekeeping forces on the move after recognizing the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Could dialogue and diplomacy help defuse escalating tensions? And 5 decades after laying the groundwork for relations between China and the U.S., the experiences and lessons from savvy and pragmatic diplomats who made history. Insights from seasoned U.S. diplomat Mark Brzezinski about the diplomatic legacy of his father, Zbigniew Brzezinski.
For the last couple of days, I really felt I was channeling my late father because he believed so much in the Sino-U.S. relationship.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. There's a lot to cover for this hour. Russia seeks to ratify treaties with breakaway Ukrainian territories before deciding on exact borders. This after Russian President Vladimir Putin signed 2 decrees recognizing the independence of Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Moscow has sent what it calls peacekeeping forces. The United States said it is coordinating with allies to announce new sanctions on Russia. Japan and the European Union also view possible sanctions. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy accused Russia of wrecking peace talks and ruled out making any territorial concessions in an address to the nation. On Tuesday, also, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency meeting on Ukraine crisis. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a phone conversation on the same day with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, talking about the Ukraine crisis. Wang Yi also did urge parties to the Munich Security Conference to work towards peace in Ukraine.
为什么大家不能坐在一起，进行充分的、深入的讨论？
Why don't the parties concerned sit together and have a full discussion to work out a roadmap and timetable to implement the deal? This is what we should do right now rather than hyping up tensions or even sensationalizing the risk of war.
For more on the latest situation in Ukraine, we are joined by a panel of 3 gentlemen. Pavan Falkenhauer, Russian political and defense analyst from Moscow. In New York, Lincoln Mitchell, adjunct associate professor of political science from Columbia University. Last but not least, in Shanghai, China, Zhao Long, professor with the Center of Russian and Central Asian Studies with Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. A lot to cover, a lot to discuss. First of all, is it still possible diplomatic efforts at this point? Mr. Zhao, observing as a third party, what do you say?
I think there's still a room for remaining in diplomatic dialogues because as we've seen, the U.S. has not yet rejected the possibility of the meeting between President Biden and President Putin. But of course, the current atmosphere will restrain the actual effect of this meeting. But again, I think there's a very important for all parties to stick on the political solutions. Compared with the meeting between heads of states, the talks between the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken, which originally scheduled for the 24th, will attach more attention, I think. The 2 sides still reserve the space for the diplomatic mediation and political dialogue, but future conversations, of course, will be much tougher than before.
Lincoln, tell me more about your thoughts. It seems that everybody is trying to place their chest as the best strategic position before those important bilateral, multilateral talks taking place. Now, is there still room for diplomacy?
Well, there's always room for diplomacy until the very end, and we can certainly hope for diplomacy. My sense is that Russia's actions over the last 24 hours are not those of a country that are looking for a diplomatic solution. that, or they are just, as you suggest, trying to get an extremely strong bargaining position. But right now, the negotiations, I would assume, between either Biden and Putin or between Lavrov and Blinken would begin with move troops, get out of Luhansk and Donetsk. So that they've kind of ratcheted up the tension, which does not lead to better negotiations. So my sense is, of course, there's always room for, and we should always try until, for as long as possible to avoid a war. But I am less confident. I'm more concerned about this than I was even 48 hours ago.
I see. Pavel, Minsk 2, that has been what everybody be talking about. Now, there are disputes about whether Russia is a party of that and what exactly has the quote-unquote the West, the NATO, been implementing its commitment according to Minsk 2. Putting that aside, do you see there is much maneuvering space for diplomacy?
Well, not really much left. The Minsk 2 it's to stop the Russian offensive in the Debaltseve region. It did that. It was about reintegrating the breakaway regions of Donbass back into Ukraine. Russia supported that. If that would change Ukraine into a kind of form of confederation where the pro-Russian regions would have a deciding stake in, say, strategic matters like, say, NATO expansion or just Ukraine becoming a NATO member or European Union.
Right.
So Russia would have a say in Ukrainian top decision making. It's clear right now, and that's what about Putin and his lieutenants were talking, that the Minsk is not working, Ukraine is not implementing, and that means no more Minsk.
Okay.
Basically, that means Russia is not supporting anymore the reintegration of the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk into Ukraine. It's a totally different situation. So the Russian strategic goal is the same, to control Ukraine. But the means are going to be very different, and they could be much more violent.
All right. So if at least 2 out of 3 of you are saying there is quite some pessimism in the air, let's talk about what's likely to happen. Now, Russia, Pavel, have sent in quote-unquote peacekeeping forces. Now, what is the strong, how should we measure the strength of this peacekeeping forces? What exactly are the roles of these forces? And what are likely to be the plan according to earlier incidents over the past 7 years, if you look back? What's likely to be the role of the peacekeeping forces, quote-unquote?
Again, the situation right now is not full, it's confused. There were reports, and actually Putin ordered the Russian Defense Ministry to ensure that fighting stops in the Donbass, but fighting did not stop. There are reports of incidents and actually people killed in fighting. And also, there's also not clear, are the Russian forces moving in or not? There are reports that they are, and then they're not. I would believe that this is primarily going to be the 150 Motor Rifle Division. That's a very big, full-strength division. It's standing as reserve for the forces in Donbass. They could easily move over the border and swiftly. But the big problem is, will the fighting stop? Right now, it's not. But there are reports of local separatist people being killed, fighters. If there are reports of Russians being killed, and these reports are carried by Russian service personnel, and if such reports are carried by Russian state media, that is going to change the situation dramatically. That's going to be Ukrainians and Russians directly in conflict, shooting
but
each other.
The threat of emergency there is very thin already, Lincoln, isn't it? I mean, when you're in a situation in which different personnels are there could be very easy possibility for conflict, direct conflict and casualties. Lincoln, what do you think likely to be the role of NATO, the role of, let's just say, some of the major European capitals and also Washington? And now they have been talking about sanctions.
Well, one of the dynamics of this of which Vladimir Putin and Russia has been acutely aware from the very beginning is that NATO, the U.S., the major European powers have fewer tools in their toolbox than we'd like to think, or that certainly we in the West would like to think. Biden has rightly ruled out using troops. The idea of engaging American or NATO troops on the ground with Russian troops in Ukraine, that would just expand the war dramatically. There will be strong sanctions put in place. That's clear, and the threat of that has not, whether or not it should is a different question, but it has not seemed to deter Putin yet. So there are not that many cards that the West has to play here. And that's something that is very, so much of the discussion in the Western media, particularly American media, has been about what should Joe Biden do? What should the United States do? And those are interesting philosophical questions. The more relevant question are what can the United States do? What can Joe Biden do? And there are fewer answers. There are fewer options there than we'd like to think. And that's really going to be a takeaway here. I mean, I just saw something as I was, looking at my phone before the show started, an article in a Western paper saying, we can't appease, the West knows the cost of appeasement. Are we suggesting we mobilize in the United States like we did to fight fascism in the 1940s? That would seem a bit of an overreaction, and a lot of people would die for what is, in fact, not a central, regardless of what you read over and over in the Western media, not the most important crisis, not the most important strategic spot in the world for the West. So there's not a lot the West is going to do here, and I think nobody knows that better than Russia.
Long, you have been watching the situation in the region for quite some years, and now you see the Chinese stance, if you interpret it, seem to be pretty much neutral, suggesting very much that everybody should stick to the earlier agreements, and all parties' security concerns should be paid attention to. Now, that statement, according to the Chinese side, of course, but you see those statements could fit into different scenarios. Of course, that's what diplomacy is about. But Long, tell me more about how China is looking at the region, particularly with China and Russia having already quite some strong strategic relationship. But at the same time, China and Ukraine are also having good relationship. Meanwhile, China and also the EU are in conversation, France, Germany, bilaterally as well. So how do you see China is observing the situation? And this is important because we're talking about it on the Chinese TV.
Yeah, of course, like you mentioned, China, of course, is watching the situation very closely. But firstly, I think behind today's tensions, they're not only the geopolitical or security games between Russia and West, but also very complex factors such as history, ethnicity, and culture between Russia and Ukraine, of which China is not one of the parties. And in addition, China and Russia are not a military alliance. There's no basis for some kind of to ask China to intervene or restrain Russia's relevant actions, and or to threaten China to bear on so-called joint responsibility for that. But I think China has clearly stated its position through multilateral or bilateral channels and urged all parties to exercise the restraint and recognize the importance of the principles of security and de-escalate the situation. And as you mentioned, of course, China and Russia are strategic partners, and China and Ukraine also strategic partners. So that's why China is calling not just to respect the security concerns of certain countries, but also to respect the principles of the UN Charter and to uphold those main principles and purpose. So I think China, of course, is playing the role as a mitigator, but by the end, there's a very big challenge for the European countries, for the United States, and for Russia to be the main actor to resolve this crisis together with Ukraine, not China, I think.
Okay. Next question, very important as well, about people's lives. Remember the conflicts years ago. Some suggest 2,500 lives being lost, others suggest 15,000. The numbers are arguable. However, lives being lost in big numbers. So can we avoid that worst scenario? To you, all of you, what is the best scenario and the ways to reach there, and how to avoid the worst scenario? I think that is very important, even when we talk about the humanitarian angle. Lincoln, would you like to go first?
Well, sure, because that's such an easy question. We should talk.
An
we
easy
should
question,
recognize
but not
the
an easy
potential for
answer,
real
I
loss
guess.
of life. The real loss of life. I know. I'm not, the potential for loss of life is very real on both sides, and that's tragic. But it's also something that should be informing Russia's calculus here. Russia can overplay its hand here because the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership have indicated that they are going to fight Russia. So Russia can come in. Russia will begin to take casualties. If Ukraine can secure a continued support of weapons from the West, which I suspect they can, then there will be a resistance. If Russia tries to occupy areas to the west of where they are now, there will be a strong resistance, and that will lead to Russian loss of life, and that will be bad for the Russian leadership at home, because now they're in an unpopular war. In addition to the loss of life on both sides, which is a very real possibility, we should also recognize people losing their homes, because people who are losing their homes become IDPs. They move from eastern Ukraine, to western parts of the country, which has already happened, or they flee the country because they want to be safe somewhere else. And that can have a ripple effect on the countries around Ukraine. Here we're talking primarily about those in Europe. So the way to avoid this is to not have, is one of two things. Either just concede and give Putin what he wants, although right now I don't think that's a great idea, but moreover, I'm not sure exactly what it is Putin does want. Because if what he really wants is Ukraine not getting into NATO, he already has that.
All right.
This frame of this being about Ukraine's NATO aspirations, that's simply not true. Everyone knows Ukraine's not getting into NATO.
For the others.
The other way you avoid it is you just keep negotiating.
Okay, thank you. Pavel, please.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, sure, understand. Pavel, please.
Well, there's a very bad scenario that the fighting on the line of control will continue when the Russian forces move in. It will be a direct Russia-Ukrainian confrontation with casualties, and that will lead to the public support in Russia for an escalation, and could escalate into an all-out Russia-Ukrainian war, which has potential of escalating further into European, God forbid. There's another scenario that when the Russian forces reach the line of control, they establish positions and control there, and the fighting stops. And there's a more or less solid ceasefire there. Though the Ukrainians don't shoot, Russians don't shoot, though both sides will be standing and staring down each other. And then there may be some time, maybe months, to figure out some kind of more permanent solution, at least a technical permanent solution, like in the Golan Heights in '74.
Okay.
I mean, they fought wars and then they stood there for quite some decades and just didn't fight with each other. That would be the best scenario.
We are wrapping our discussion right now. Time is up. I know there are a lot to say from all of you. I hope we're going to continue our conversation in the latter days. Hope there will be better news that we can talk about then. Thank you so much, the three of you. Pavel, Lincoln, Long, appreciate it. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come in the program. 5 decades after laying the groundwork for relations between China and the U.S., the experiences and lessons from the savvy and pragmatic diplomat who made history. Insights from seasoned U.S. diplomat Mark Brzezinski about the diplomatic legacy of his father, Zbigniew Brzezinski.